Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another eclectic evening of military history. Used to be military engineering history, and the local association decided to enlarge the group in the areas of interest this evening. So we're going to get even more eclectic this evening. We've got 4 topics. The first one basically deals with propaganda and communications during the First World War and the Second World War. The second one is our firefighting services, something we don't probably talk enough about. And we're going to get a very quick history of firefighting, what it's come through and what it does today. The third one will be a hands-on presentation of improvised explosive devices and what we do as engineers to counter those on the modern battlefield. And the fourth item, very broad topic area, the Canadian Forces Expeditionary Operations.
And do we get to build an IED?
Sorry?
You said it was hands-on. Do we get to build?
We do, yes. Sorry, as part of my introduction, I should have reminded people I'm fairly hard of hearing. So there will be no questions of the MC. If we do have questions throughout the presentations, would ask you to hold them to the end of each of the presentations, please. So our first presentation is on the topic of the Canadian wartime posters. Now, many of us are probably quite familiar with the iconic U.S. Army World War II poster, Uncle Sam Needs You. Well, every nation was involved in propaganda during the war, both sides and every country that participated in the war, because propaganda was an extremely important tool to get the nation fully involved. Tonight we can learn about some of the efforts of propaganda via the posters as seen during the First World War and the Second World War. Get an idea of their role in recruiting, in the war effort as a whole, and very specifically to get the local population to contribute to war bond efforts. To help us through the subject, this evening we have John Robertson. John enlisted in the Black Watch in 1953 as a soldier, promoted in 1971 to warrant officer, commissioned the same year. As an officer, he was instructed in the Combat Arms School, being the infantry career manager, and held a variety of staff positions at NDHQ. John retired in '92, and since retiring, he's been a volunteer guide at a lecture at the Canadian War Museum, and has been a tour guide on many Canadian military history tours of the battlefields in Europe. With no further ado, Robbie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ken. Is there any way we can dim the lights a bit? Might be able to see the posters better, as long as I can see my notes. Is that possible? Before we kick off? Anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robbie Robertson from the Royal Canadian Regiment Association, and you might want to know a little bit more of my background than what Ken provided you. So all I've got to say is that going back to my family history, my father was a miner way up in the Malamute. My mother was a hostess. I thought engineers would know that. Sorry about that.
They're kind of slow tonight, Robbie.
I gotta have this one on. Is that possible? Anyway, I don't like normally to do this, but I'm going to start off by the only 2 engineer jokes I know. And the first one is, what is the difference between a mechanical engineer and a civil engineer? The engineers probably know it, so I'll aim this at the RCR guys. A mechanical engineer builds weapons, one type of them. A civil engineer builds the targets. 2 engineers were standing at the base of a flagpole, and their task was to estimate how tall, how high the flagpole was, and they were having a real problem. A woman walked up and asked what they were doing. They said, well, we're trying to figure out the height of this flagpole, but we don't have a ladder or anything to check it out. So she said, taking out a wrench from her purse, she said, maybe I can help you. She loosened a couple of bolts at the end of the flagpole, brought the flagpole to the ground, took out a tape measure, measured the distance of the flagpole and said 21 feet, 6 inches, and then she walked away. And one engineer just shook his head and laughed, and he said, "How ridiculous. A lot of good that does us. We asked for the height, and she gives us the length." Anywho, the aim of my little talk on Canadian wartime posters is to provide a sampling of some of these Canadian wartime propaganda posters to show you how this form of psychological warfare often played a rather important part in the war effort. Now, propaganda, as we know, is something that seeks to persuade. Advertising, PR people, and propaganda often employ the same one-sided techniques. The use of posters actually started to come into effect in 1789 when the lithograph process was invented, and they could produce these large size posters and hang them all over the place. In about 1890s, posters became used rather widely here in Canada, mostly for political purposes at that time. The advantages of posters, for example, radios can be turned off, pamphlets or newspapers can be chucked away, political meetings, you don't have to attend them if you don't want to. Likewise, the movie house, but everybody walks in the streets, and posters just couldn't be avoided if they were put up in the right places. So if you were to avert your eyes from a poster, there would be another one right around the corner. Now we'll go into, I'm just going to get a little briefer before I go into the actual displays of the posters we have. I just wanted to mention that in the First World War, posters were very important because this was the period before the growth of radio, television, obviously, and film. And a lot of the posters, as you will see shortly, were devoted to recruiting for the various units. And the government had no overall control of the posters. A lot of the units were given a certain amount of money, or they went out and got donations, and they then drew up their own posters and distributed them, and they weren't under any control for the most part of the First World War. A little different from the Second World War, as I'll mention. At first, the Canadian posters, the tone of the Canadian posters was jovial. The start of the First World War, we're all going off, it's only going to be a short war, we'll be home for Christmas, all this stuff. So the posters were rather jovial and quite naive, as you'll probably see. The range of the posters would vary from just a few hundred to sometimes something like 50,000 copies. And most of them were produced in either Montreal, Hamilton, or Toronto, which were the big printing centers in Canada at the time. The Canadian posters were very similar to a lot of the British ones, but Canada often directed some of their posters towards the ethnic groups in Canada. The bulk of the posters were, of course, to try and get people to enlist and join in the army before conscription came out later in the First World War, and for the general public to buy victory bonds, to contribute money to produce war equipment, etc., etc. Many regiments and civilian companies produced their own individual posters. First World War posters, as opposed to Second World War posters, included a lot of text. There's a lot of writing on their posters. Second World War posters, as we'll look at, concentrated more on a slogan. The First World War posters tried to get people to enlist, whereas the Second World War posters, a lot of them, as we'll see in a second or so, was more or less an order. You will enlist. You have to enlist. A later theme in Canada was that the fighting in Europe, as it didn't involve Canada. Canada in the First World War, their posters were not as gruesome, didn't show a lot of the atrocities attributed to the enemy that other countries had, particularly the United States when they went to war. All the posters in the First World War were lithographs, and a very few of them were dated or signed. So most were anonymous. We don't know who did them. So in the Second World War, however, the day before Canada entered the Second World War, which I assume, although that hasn't been spelled out in my readings on this subject, was the 9th of 9th of September 1939. They were centralized immediately under control of what was called the Public Bureau of Information. And in 1942, what they called the Wartime Information Board took over the production and distribution of posters. As Canada was not particularly under attack, it avoided violence in a lot of the posters that we produced compared with other countries. Now, the United States also wasn't under attack, but for some reason or other, they had a lot of violent posters. Posters also came out for the working people to increase productivity. The Second World War had a lot better use of slogans and graphics. Okay, let's take a look at the first one here. I got my little pointers there someplace. The one on the left is for the 148th Battalion, First World War, and the one on the right is Second World War. Now this one here, you see a guy rather expressionless stabbing a symbol of the German eagle. The Second World War posters, they got away from using symbols and directed their posters more towards an emotional effect. The guy is emotional, or he's got his weapon ready to go. Let's go Canada, sort of thing, as opposed to the not so stimulating ones of the 148th Battalion. This poster on the left was done by a Percy Nobbs in 1915. He was also an Olympic fencer, not that this enters into the program or anything, but how many people here, for example, have been to RMC or went to RMC? Okay, you obviously know where Curry Hall is. The same chap that designed that poster designed Curry Hall, believe it or not. The other poster, the one on the right, won a poster competition just shortly after the end of the Second World War. It was considered one of the best posters issued in that war. So there was a great variety because there was a great number of artists from almost unknown guys in some dusty little shop that produced posters to well-known artists. So obviously there was a great difference in the number and variety of posters that came out. The posters were not meant as to be any sort of historic document, but in the course of time they've become important resources on aspects of wartime life. They convey the intensity and the immediacy of a bygone era. So let's look at some of the posters. The first ones we're going to look at are First World War ones. Let's look at the first one. I'm awful hoarse. This is obviously the Canadian Grenadier Guards. Shows a guy in their dress uniform. They were being formed under a General Meehan, who commanded a training division in England during the First World War. Let's go to the second one. The second one is for the Royal Highlanders of Canada, one time known as the 5th Royal Highlanders of Canada. And you will apply to their armory at 429 Bloor Street. Place is still there, and you can apply if you wish. And let's look at the next one. Okay, this one here is by an Arthur Hyder, and he was a chap, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the officers' mess, there's a painting of Partybird Battle down in the infantrymen, is not? He's the chap that did that painting. I'm not talking about the Majuba thing, I'm talking about the other one. He's the chap that painted that painting. Okay. This one here is rare because it's one of the ones produced in Canada that has a sort of a violent theme to it. As I say, most of the Canadian ones did not. It's by a chap by the name of Charles David, who was a lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Engineers. Let's have a hand for him. Sorry. Next one, please. 207th Ottawa Carleton Battalion poster. This is your flag. Next one. Am I going too fast, by the way?
A little bit.
A little bit? Okay, we'll slow down a bit if I can. The next one is a poster for the Queen's University Highlanders, and I thought that meant that people that went to Queen's University had to qualify to get into this unit, something like that. But I was reading Nicholson's book on the Canadian Expeditionary Force 1418 the other day, and he said that There was next to nobody from Queen's University in this battalion, the 253rd. You are needed to take my place. 244th Battalion poster. I might point out that a lot of these posters, most of the posters came out in the English language and were then translated, the same poster, but French words were put to them. Unfortunately, there was a few screw-ups on that one. They came up with a poster, which I'm not showing here. I have a copy of it, but it was in black and white, and I said, not a heck. They had a poster showing a bunch of wounded people, and in English, the poster read, "It's your move," which meant to people that looked at the poster, it's your move to replace these casualties. The translation into French said, "It's your turn," which the French interpreted as your turn to get wounded. So there were a few foul-ups here and there on these things. Okay? Your chums are fighting. I don't know the date of it, but I'm going to presume it was before 1960 because they're wearing soft caps and steel helmets weren't issued until sometime in 1916, early 1916, I think. Right, okay. Aha! Ho-ho! Royal Canadian Regiment poster. This is a Second World War poster. It's the only one I could lay my hands on for the Royal Canadian Regiment. And I suspect that when it originally came out, somebody spelt senior wrong. That's a suspicion. I can't verify that, but that's a hunch I have. Let's look at the next one. There we go for you engineer folks. Sorry about this URL down here. I just got it from the website that I stole the picture from. Okay. This one here is one of the first of the posters that appealed to ethnic groups, namely, in this case, the Scots in Canada. Joined the 1342nd 73rd Battalion of the Royal Highlanders, or Black Watch. The thing that puzzles me about this particular poster is this line here. Every Scottish Canadian is expected to do his part for England. I'm not sure the Scots would be looking at it too favorably. Okay, next one. A sample of one for Irish Canadians. Irish Canadian Rangers. They became part of the 5th Division, which was eventually disbanded, and the personnel were sent to 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th Canadian Divisions. Okay, ta-da. This one here is a poster directed obviously towards the First Nations people. I think today it would probably be considered somewhat racist, but there you have it. Okay. Now here's an example of the poster trying to use a bit of humor in the First World War. Again, sorry for that URL down there, which didn't really go over very well at all. Again, for the 253rd Highlanders, the Queen's University guys. Okay, let's go to the next one. To the women of Canada. Women in the First World War had two major roles. Of course, they worked in industry and they also worked as nurses. There were no units, regiments for women in the First World War. By the war's end, about 35,000 women had worked in munitions work, but very few stayed on in that job after the First World War was over. There were 1,900 nurses in the First World War. Now, para 3, do you realize that the one word go from you might send another man to fight for our king and country? In the early part of the First World War, I don't know if it went to the end of the First World War or not, if you were married, you had to get the permission of your wife before you could join up and go off to fight. As I say, I don't know if that applied throughout the war. They changed it. Next one, please. Again, same sort of thing. I suppose that's supposed to be his wife, but it looks like his mom to me. Anyhow. Okay, now we're going to take a look at some posters to try and convince the public to buy victory bombs. This is the first one. I would put this guy on a charge for a small pack being worn far too low, but we won't go into that this particular time. Next one, please. Landover Castle was a ship, a hospital ship, that was sunk by a German submarine. I forget the year exactly, it's 1917, I think. And the German submarine then commenced to ram all the lifeboats and machine everybody in the water. One lifeboat, I think, got away, but 14 nurses were killed or drowned, and it became a very, very heightened propaganda thing for posters. Okay, next one. Pave the way to victory, buy victory bonds. If you've looked at, and I'm sure a lot of you have, some of the films of the First World War, there's a shot that goes by these troops going by waving their helmets and all this sort of stuff. And that's what that poster is taken from, except that, of course, they've used victory bonds as the pavement instead of the actual pavement. Okay, next one. Poster by Frank Nicolette. In 1918, that poster came out. Am I still going too fast, guys?
No, it's good.
I am? Yes or no?
You're good. You're doing good.
Okay, okay. Next one then. This is a poster for the Canadian, from the Canadian Food Board. That's their logo down on the lower right-hand side. To save, for the general public, to save food for the military. Okay, now we're going to jump into the Second World War. And we have this poster here. The first one, chap on a motorcycle with a knight behind him, sort of trying to get the association between a motorcycle and a knight. This came out in 1941-42. It was by a chap by the name of Eric Aldwinkle. He was eventually became the RCAF official war artist. When I researched this Aldwinkle guy, I found a very interesting fact about him. He failed his history exam in either high school or university, I can't remember which, so he got out because he was asked what was the significance of Laura Secord, and he said, she invented chocolates. No, he blew that one. Next one. This was a poster of a series, it was a series of posters called Men of Valor. This particular one, of course, represents Colonel C. Smerritt at Dieppe. You know the action, you probably know the background, Victoria Cross, prisoner of war, da-da-da. This was done, as I say, by Hubert Rogers, who was an artilleryman in the First World War, and he worked in Ottawa here for the War Information Board, and he lived in Manitou, and he died in Ottawa. I don't have the year, I forgot to get that. Next one, please. This is a poster trying to encourage women to join the Canadian Women's Army Corps, or quacks as they call them. Sorry about the fuzziness of it. I think it says whatever it says. Again, in the Second World War presentation. And in the Second World War, of course, we did have female units in both the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and over 50,000 females served in one or other of those formations in the Second World War. Okay, next. Another poster to try and encourage women to join the Canadian Women's Army Corps, the quack, trying to draw a connection between modern women and, in this case, Joan of Arc, by a Gordon Odell, this particular poster. Okay? This is a poster to increase the morale of part-time war workers. And this female is giving some untitled gentleman a slap in the chops. Okay, next. Every Canadian must fight. So again, they're drawing a connection between the industrial worker and the man at the front. This one here is by a Philip Surrey, member of the Order of Canada, and I found out that he was a founder of CAS, and I didn't realize that CAS had a designated founder. And I checked out the history and everything else in the Combat Arms School, and I couldn't find anything about him there, and then eventually I found out he founded the Contemporary Artists Society. So it blew me away. Next one is Attack, also by Hubert Rogers, the Manitic guy. And finally, one to victory by a Nova Scotian artist named Charles Wilcox. Now I'm going to go into a little more detail on the victory bonds one. Let's take a look at the next one here, if we can. Ooh, we skipped one. No, we didn't, sorry, my apologies. Freedom or Slavery, I think that's by a Gwen Fremlin. I was unable to get much information, but I believe she was a lady that worked also here in Ottawa. Okay, next please. Choose your bonds. Two types of bonds. The victory bonds or those kind of bonds. That was by an H.V. Shaw. Okay, it doesn't take long to get the point behind these posters, and that's the point behind these posters. Next one, please. Okay, keep your hands off, keep these hands off rather. The Nazi symbol and the Japanese symbol attempting to abuse a lady and her child. Okay, next one. Did we skip one? No, sorry, go back. No, my apologies again. Okay, a guy using the very rarely used anti-aircraft mounting for a Brid gun. And to me, that looks like a First World War tank. What do you think? I mean, it's possible it's a Second World War tank, but I said, no, I don't think so. Next, please. Okay, nothing to say about that except that it came out in 1944 or 1945. Next one, please. This one here is a poster for saving waste paper to be used for ammunition. And the picture at the bottom, I would almost swear that it's a picture of my father's regiment in the Second World War, the Toronto Scottish Regiment, because there's a picture in one of their histories of that sort of exact pose. Not that you couldn't get other units to do it either, but the Toronto Scottish was a heavy machine gun unit, and I think that's where they got that illustration from at the bottom of the thing. Next one, please. Give blood donations. This is the thrust behind this one. Now this is unusual for the period because it has both English and French on the same poster. That was very rare for the time. Usually they would design a poster in English and then make the translation, as I mentioned earlier, into French. Okay, next please. This is a poster by a chap by the name of Harry Mayarovich, who signed his posters Mayo. He did a great number of posters during the war. He exhibited in Ottawa here in the National Arts Centre in 1981. And you didn't get many careless talk sort of posters and security type posters in the First World War. It was only because of the advancement in communications between the First and the Second World War that people really started being concerned about spies in Canada and careless talk about troop movements and that sort of thing. This guy here, I find out, this Mayarovich, also designed Brian Mulroney's residence, wherever that might be. Not that that has anything to do. Okay, next one is the last one. I think, no, it's not quite the last one. That's either an awful small rifle or a pretty big giant of a guy gripping that thing. Right, the last one, please. Self-described. Okay. Next one, please. Get rid of that one fast. Any questions on posters? Thank you. How's my time going? Over time? Okay. No, any questions? Yes?
Do we have any idea how many posters were created in the First World War and the Second World War?
Certainly not for the First World War, because every individual did their own production of the posters. The design would be given to the commanding officer. He would either approve it or not. He'd send it to the local printers. They would print however many. Nobody had any control over it in the First World War. And that's a very good question, and I'll mark it down for my next poster lecture. No, I don't know about the Second World War. Yes?
Would you comment on the completeness of the collection of the posters in the War Museum?
Yes.
Is it?
It's a pretty good complete collection. Yeah, very good. A lot of our posters are saved there. But of course, a lot of the posters just disappeared. We don't know what happened. Okay? Thank you.